Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Deepa Majumdar. I teach philosophy at PNW, and I'm the coordinator of this series titled Race, Racism, Anti-Racism. Welcome to today's event, which is the third in our series. It's a presentation titled Media Framing and the Politics of Racism by PNW Professor Dr. Lee Artz, with guest speaker Jae Yates. Our moderator is Dr. Karen Bishop-Morris. I'd like to start with a dedication of this series, which is why we're showing you this candle. In 2020 alone, police have shot and killed over 800 people, of whom almost 20% were Black youth, meaning at a disproportionate rate given the race demographics of the US. It is unfortunate that we have a pool of victims to choose from. This should not be the case. Everyone knows of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor because they have made the national news. But closer to home, we have Sean Reed killed in Indianapolis in May 2020, Rashad Cunningham in Gary in August 2019, and Eric Logan in South Bend in June 2019. We dedicate this series of lecture discussions to their memory and in protest of their killings by police. So the purpose of this series is as follows. Since the brutal killing of George Floyd, millions of Americans and people in other countries have been shocked and outraged. Hundreds of protests have been held, perhaps the largest demonstrations against racism since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The purpose of this Zoom-based series, featuring monthly presentations by scholars, journalists, and civic representatives addressing multiple aspects of racism and anti-racism, is to sympathize with the times and current protests against racism, to provide extracurricular education on race, racism, and anti-racism, and to focus on Western racism, domestic and international, especially the African-American experience, while recognizing that racism exists in many countries worldwide. I have many people to thank for making this series possible, in particular Jae Yates for giving us your precious time and being here with us today, Dr. Lee Artz and Dr. Bishop-Morris, Chancellor Keon and Provost Holford for funding this series, Sue Bremer, Catherine Olson, Dean Carey, Liz Rodriguez, and Rachel Pollack, PNW Office of Information Technology, especially Jason, my colleagues who helped plan this series, especially Lee Artz, Kim Sipes, Meeta Chaudhary, and Colette Morrow. And above all of you here in the audience, today is election day. It's midday. You could be doing 100,000 different things, but you're here joining us in this worthy cause. So you are cordially welcome to today's event and to attend the one remaining event in fall 2020. And just so you know, we're in the process of preparing registration for the spring 2021 portion of this series as well. But for fall 2020, we have one remaining event, which is Dr. Kim Sipes' presentation with Q&A on November 30th. And that is, please note the time is different. It's not at 12:30. It starts at 2 p.m. and ends at 3:15 p.m. And it's titled, How to Talk About Race in the 21st Century. You're also welcome. So I've already mentioned the spring 2021 portion of our program. As far as today's program goes, please bear with us if we have any kind of power outage or other technical glitch. We are relying on Zoom technology. We hope nothing will happen. I would now like to introduce Dr. Karen Bishop-Morris, who is Associate Professor of English at PNW. She is a frequent invited speaker and panelist on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she has received awards for her work on diversity. So I'm now going to, Dr. Bishop-Morris is now going to take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Majumdar, for recognizing the Black lives lost through racialized police violence and for reminding us of the importance to reflect when possible and to, of course, say their names. And again, I'd like to add a special thanks to our listening and viewing audience. As Professor Majumdar said, there are so many ways you could spend your lunch hour other than another Zoom. So thank you so much. We're really grateful to have you with us today. I'd like to throw out a special thank you to Jason Jeffries for lending technical support today. These things are never the work of one or two individuals. And so it's important to take a moment to recognize those who work behind the scenes. The importance of this series on race, racism, and anti-racism cannot be overstated. If you are neutral in the face of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Words to Live By from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The impetus for this discussion grew entirely out of faculty who felt accountable and responsible to our students and the community we serve to shine a light on racial injustice and to create an open space for dialogue. It's important to note that while our early discussions were centered on racial violence in relation to police brutality, the conversation and scope of this series quickly expanded to acknowledge and account for the structural and systemic racism that has characterized institutions for hundreds of years. These issues are complex, they are uncomfortable, and yet we cannot use complexity to excuse inaction. In the words of Melody Hobson, we must be #colorbrave and engage. We have to call out injustice where we find it, and we have to invite those who are making policy, those who we are making policy about. We have to make sure that we are inviting those folks to the table. The Black experience is not monolithic. The Black community is an extremely diverse community. Black citizens represent every position, every perspective, education level, economic strata, and so on. No one Black person speaks for or represents the entire spectrum of the Black experience. So as we educate ourselves and listen and learn, we should be mindful not to essentialize the Black experience. The tie that binds all of us, especially those who struggle in the face of racial disparities, racial profiling, racism in any form, is that we share the human condition. And yet centuries of oppression have produced an environment in which it has become acceptable to disregard and dismiss the humanity of Black people on sight and on the basis of the color of their skin. The time is always right to do what is right. And the very fact that we are opening a dialogue and committing to take action means that today is already a win. And so with that, I'd like to just turn to a few housekeeping matters. The first is, if you are viewing this presentation in Zoom, please switch to speaker view. If you click the icon in the upper right-hand corner and switch from gallery to speaker view, it's very likely that you will have the best possible viewing experience, and it will also help our recording if we are focused on our special guest and Professor Artz. And on that note, let me just remind you that we are recording this session. And so if your preference is not to have your name or your countenance visible on the screen, then we invite you to view this presentation live. We are live streaming on Facebook. You simply need to search for PNW series on race, racism, and anti-racism. And naturally, we will make this recording available post-event. We invite you to mark your calendars for the remaining events for the fall series. As Professor Majumdar mentioned, there is just one, November 30th, which is a Monday, 2 to 3:15, with Professor Kim Sipes on how to talk about race in the 21st century. And lastly, it's important to note that the views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Purdue University Northwest, the PNW faculty organizers, or others who may be associated with its production. Lastly, second to last, but real lastly, attendees, we invite you to begin posting questions in the chat just as soon as you have them. The chat will be managed by me, the moderator, and I really do think that's our final note before I get into an introduction of Professor Lee Artz. Professor Lee Artz will then in turn introduce our special guest. Lee Artz is a professor and researcher of transnational media, democracy, and the public sphere, and depictions of race, nationality, and the globalization of entertainment. Dr. Artz earned his undergraduate degree in English at Wayne State University, where he minored in Black Studies. At Wayne State, Artz worked with the Black Workers Congress, the NAACP, and the Detroit Mayor's Office to establish an official African Liberation Day in the city. He also campaigned vigorously for desegregation of the Detroit public schools. He became a coordinator for the National Student Coalition Against Racism in Boston, defending school desegregation with community groups and labor unions against racist violence against Black students. Encouraged by his union affiliations, Artz apprenticed as a machinist in the Steelworkers Union, chairing his union's Affirmative Action Committee and editing the local union paper. After a decade as a machinist, his union contract funded his master's degree in communication, and the rest, they say, is history. After earning his PhD at the University of Iowa, Artz taught at Loyola Chicago and now Purdue University Northwest. And as we like to say, he is not new to this. He is true to this work. He has published 12 authored or edited books addressing media practices, democracy, and social justice, especially with respect to race and class. More than 70 plus journal articles, over 100 invited university and public lectures, scores of awards, highly decorated, the Sujak Award for Outstanding Teaching at Loyola, a Distinguished Book Award, many publications and journal chapters on race, racism, and anti-racism, some of the titles which you've seen, as well as many invited lectures. He continues to teach and publish on race and class representations in the news, entertainment, including his topic today, which is the media framing of race and inequality. Please join me in welcoming Professor Burton Lee Artz.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Deepa. Thank you, everyone that has made this possible, including the Provost and the Chancellor. Today, we want to talk about how the meaning of race in the 21st century is communicated. If we watch the media now, or read the media now, we may believe that the protests in Portland, Kenosha, Baltimore, LA, Chicago are led by looters, rioters, thugs, criminals. We can hear what the mayors of Minneapolis, Portland, New York City, or even the Black mayor in Chicago refers to those people as thugs and vigilantes. At the same time, we often sense that the meaning of things depends on how reality affects our relation to those things and to each other, our social position, our political, cultural, personal experience, and our sharing of those experiences with others. Racism exists, and millions are affected by it, inflicted by it. But whites don't experience racism the same as blacks, so often can claim ignorance or disbelief. I mean, we had Obama as president, so we're living in a post-racial society, right? In daily life, we create words, codes, practices to share, but we always draw those understandings from larger cultural meanings. In that sense, media, including social media, remain our primary means for constructing and popularizing those meanings. With no direct experience, we have to rely upon media frames. What we know about Iraq, China, Venezuela, Iran, what we know about the coronavirus. Most whites don't have direct experience with police gangs. We end up reading and watching media, social media. So we end up, some, fearing terrorism, Antifa, white supremacists, the virus. The support for the US invasion of Iraq was based on media reports of weapons of mass destruction. The reports of reopening restaurants is based on media reports of declining virus infections. Support for protests about police violence were based on media reports about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Black, Wallace, many others. In other words, media have a tremendous influence on the public agenda and set the frame for our understanding. Media don't directly lie, or very often, but they do select and frame and obscure by meeting traditional journalistic norms that have an ideological effect. In the case of racism and racist practices, Black Americans and other people of color have daily experiences of inequality and injustice. But most whites are unaware because whites don't experience driving while black or being hassled by cops or pressure from the economic conditions we live in. Most people don't know about inequality. The National Economic Report just issued in June reports that white wealth on average is $170,000. Black wealth on average is $17,000. That does not mean that all whites or rural and urban working class whites have wealth. It just means they don't experience it as a consequence of racism, but as social class, or generally getting the short end of the policies and practices, and consider Black inequality personal failure or a cultural defect. Really, most Americans don't know about police violence, driving while Black, walking while Black, working while Black. Instead, whites read and watch news, entertainment, and other depictions and are not inherently racist, but are structurally implicated in a system with a vocabulary and practices that enact behaviors and norms and vocabularies, and those are all communicatively dependent on the media. In all cases, race, gender, the economy, war, the virus, existing social power organizes and expresses their interests through the media industry that constructs meaning. On May 25th, however, the dominance of the news media was broken. Public awareness was raised about the meaning of police abuse because it became clear with that video of George Floyd being choked to death. Millions saw and witnessed police violence dramatically, clearly. The man was restrained, controlled, and then choked and killed. The violence was visible. It went viral globally, nationally. The subsequent protests, the media itself had no choice but to cover it. That 8-minute and 46-second killing of Floyd raised questions that refuted all of the previous police arguments. So a question comes to us. Was the evidence of the Floyd killing and the following protests enough to change public perceptions and actions? The question is, how do media help or hinder our understanding and claims of systemic racism? I would say that depends to a significant degree on how media cover those conditions, or if the media even do report those events. So that's the question for today. How do the media report on race, racism, and politics in the 21st century? We can't fully report on my investigation and the findings that my colleague Ron Turrell and I were still in the middle of our research, but we hope to publish that in both journals and share it on social media. But I want to share with you some of the findings that have already become clear. I looked at the New York Times primarily, but also the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and we're currently working on the Kenosha News and the Milwaukee Journal following the Jacob Blake shooting. All I can provide you with here are several highlights, several key points that should help and raise our understanding of how citizens can form beliefs. I'm using the concept of media framing. I want to share this with you so that you can see some of the things that I am referring to. Media framing in media study research has a decades-long history. Media framing has found that the media tend to select events to report because they can't report on all the news. They select how to explain those events. In other words, the meaning is constructed, and they suggest how to interpret and judge the participants in those events. The frame here is a metaphor for a window. A window. If you look out from where you are now on Zoom and you look out the window in your room, you will see true, real, not fake, but only partially a frame, a window to the world. Even if you were to have windows on every side of your room, all you could see is your immediate surroundings. Outside of that, for the rest of the world, we rely upon the media frames, the windows to the world that media editors and publishers decide is news, important, and how it should be explained. Media framing specifically does 4 things: defines events, diagnoses causes, evaluates participants, and then identifies a preferred action. Historically, the media has covered the killing of citizens, that police actions are necessary to secure the safety and security in the face of criminal behavior. In the case of news on police shootings and protests against police killings, there also is a long history. There's a long tradition of media framing that casts the victim as a suspect, as blaming the victim. A long history of deferring to the version by the police. They're, after all, public servants, so we rely upon the police reports, and occasionally admitting that there might be a rogue cop or an individual cop that abuses their power. But there's an avoidance of the context of police practices, coercion, and the occupation of the Black community. Most killings have been framed as justified or maybe unfortunate tragedies, but rarely as murder, rarely as injustice, and never as a racial practice. There's plenty of evidence of police killing unarmed citizens, not just Black citizens. In the last 5 years, 6,500 people more have been killed by police. 1,600 were unarmed Black citizens. 800 this year, more than 250 were Black Americans. More whites, but the proportion of Blacks to the population is huge. Unarmed Black citizens are 4 times more often killed than white citizens. And that list is long, from Elijah McClain, who was choked to death in Colorado because he looked suspicious wearing a mask, to the February vigilante cop killing of Ahmaud Arbery for jogging through his neighborhood, to Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her home by a police gang raid on drugs, Rayshard Brooks killed in a Wendy's parking lot in June in Atlanta. In Indianapolis, police killed 2 men in 1 day, and they had no body cam or no dash cam video, despite the law that says, the police reform that says they should be wearing those. On August 22nd, Trayford Pellerin in Lafayette, Louisiana was shot 10 times, and the day after, Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times in Kenosha. He survived, but he was paralyzed. There's 200 more that we don't have time. Unfortunately, there's more than we can even identify. But police abuse of Black citizens and people of color and immigrants is so commonplace that Chester Himes, noted American author, said police brutality toward Black people in the US is so common and long-standing that it has attained acceptance as proper behavior. The interesting thing here is that recent citizen reporting has upset the media privileging of the police report. Citizen recordings of the killing of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, George Floyd have refuted the credibility of police reports. In some cases, even those dash cams and body cams have disputed the police accounts. And importantly, evidence suggests that public knowledge informs public belief and prompts public action. After the May 25th shooting of George Floyd, killing of George Floyd was videotaped and shared, by the end of May, 26 million people participated in protests of police violence against Blacks. The Pew Research poll found that more than 2/3 supported Black Lives Matter. The Monmouth poll found that after the protests, 76% of America thinks racism is a major problem, and 72% favored reallocating funds away from the police to social services like mental health care, spousal abuse, healthcare, and education. The public outpouring of opposition to police violence even prompted some of corporate America to make donations to Black Lives Matter and other cosmetic changes, even as they were financing the police. The Pew poll in September, however, found still a majority of Americans, 55%, supported the demonstrations, but it was down from that 2/3 majority. In June, a majority of white adults, about 60%, supported Black Lives Matter. By September, fewer than half showed the same support. So the question is, why the change in public support from May to September? I would suggest, and the findings suggest, that it's an awareness based on media coverage, because without direct experience, we only understand things from the way the media frames events. And the shifting framing explains the shifting in public opinion. So the effect of knowing, seeing, witnessing what Black citizens experience daily with police brutality and police violence with impunity affected American attitudes. So 2 questions are posed here. How did the media frame the aftermath of the Floyd killings? How did the media frame it later after the protests gained momentum and began having some public effect? So I wondered if the change in public response reflected a change in media framing. In fact, I found that the public opinion followed the media coverage shifting to focus on protests as disruptive. It would be one thing if public opposition that was perceived as violence and looting was accurate, but it's not. A few weeks after framing was on police violence and the charges of racism, and protests were explained as legitimate that came from outrage and the recognition of the non-responsive police and city government, which had the effect on public awareness, it changed. I'm going to show you a few of examples from the New York Times. These are headlines from early in May from the New York Times, front page. The Minneapolis police, long accused of racism, face the wrath of the wounded city. I realize I can't leave these up. I can't provide you with all of the examples. So as I go through these, you might jot down the date and you can look them up, or at the end, I will give you my email if you want to get some more of the information and some of the evidence. On the 26th, they explain that the videos show that the sanitized and short version by the police gave a drastically different story when we see what citizens see. But by June 1st, those examples had changed. The examples that focused on the justification of response to police violence shifted from police violence and killing of Black citizens, and it became reported as disruption to the public order. So here's the media framing by June 1st. Events were defined as disruptive and public nuisance. They were diagnosed as caused by protests, often illegal, and they evaluated the participants as looters and criminals, and the actions that were prescribed were more police, National Guard, and more prosecutions. This is what it looks like after June 1st. NBC News, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they're framing the events primarily as violent, disruptive, dangerous. The Star-Tribune in Minneapolis quotes the governor who says there's destructive protests and the police chief who says that the police are overwhelmed with violence. The New York Times has a review of its first 2 weeks of coverage, but they find something different because they feature photos from George Floyd protests across dozens of cities, almost all of them showing violent, disruptive actions, as they say, prompting the activation of the National Guard. Or even when they have a headline that says police violence is there, the response is explained as looters. The Washington Post doesn't even have that caveat. They simply say mass protests and mayhem continued and people are arrested. It would be one thing if they were reporting what happened and giving us that perception, but their reports are inaccurate. Their reports are not unfactual, but they are a distorted assessment by selecting specific facts, specific instances that are at odds with the actual conditions. The Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project from Princeton reviewed protests across the country from May 26th to August 22nd. They looked at more than almost 8,000 protests, and they found that there was no violence, no disruption in 93% of those demonstrations. They did find that in more than 100 of those demonstrations, there were car attacks that people driving in to peaceful protesters. They also found that in 170 events, the police showed up and used tear gas, in the majority of cases, rubber bullets, pepper spray, baton beatings. So 93% of demonstrations have no violence. 100 of them have violence caused by people that are driving in, trying to injure protesters. 170 events had violence caused by or confronted by the police. So we're probably talking even fewer of the demonstrations had any violence, but we still get that framing. This is not something new. Decades ago, McLeod and Hertog and many researchers since then identified what they called as a protest paradigm in news coverage, which is a pattern of news coverage that expresses disapproval of protests and dissent. So the question is, why is it happening now? Why can't we see this media framing? Why can't we notice the defining, the diagnosing, the evaluating, and the preferred actions? Why don't we see it immediately? Well, it's partly because the media is not alone. The media framing parallels and reinforces our larger culture. What we see in action movies, what we see in police procedurals, what we see on TV shows and the news, what we hear from the politicians running for office, both of whom are against defunding the police, what we find in public education from the 4th grade on, what we hear in universities, what we know from the police, the courts, the prisons, the experience of working conditions and the unequal wages, means that the framing by the police is not seen as unusual. It's rational. It's rational for the journalists and for those of us that just look at the news or read the news on an occasional or even a daily basis looking at social media. Some things don't become apparent to us. There are 3 primary techniques that we found in looking at the coverage of police violence and the protests since the Floyd killing. The first is there is a preference for official, legitimate sources, which include primarily police chiefs, mayors, very few sources from the community or protesters themselves. A second technique is the descriptions. So the news has to explain to us who these people are. The interesting thing is that the language tends to discredit those people. A student in my class earlier today noted that there was a front page story that showed people standing in line to vote, and it said, "Democracy in action." But you never saw in any newspaper in the United States a picture of 26 million people protesting violence that said, "Look, here's democracy in action." Instead, we get descriptions of them that they don't represent many people or that they're up to no good. The context that we see is usually lacking because the preference of the media is to give us spectacle over substance. Again, I don't have time to give you everything, what we find. Part of the question is, why would the media do this? Well, the media is an industry to make a profit from readers and advertisers. Spectacle is a news norm. There's a limit on investigative journalist costs. It costs money and time and takes energy. For a journalist to find the phone number of Jae Yates in Minneapolis is difficult. For the journalist to call the police chief and the mayor, they're there. And the mayor and the police chief are probably issuing news reports daily and making suggestions of how this should be understood. This is not a conspiracy. It's not a plot. It's the standard way that media do business. I'm going to give you a few examples. There's countless from all of the major papers, but I'm choosing the liberal newspaper of record to make the point. For 9 stories in the second week of August, the New York Times had 65 sources quoted and cited. 47 were mayors, state officials, police, business owners. 8 were attorneys of the victims. 5 were Black residents. They were all on one story about Roseland, Chicago. 3 were from a victim or victims' families, but only 2 were from people that were actually organizing protests. In the opinion pages, it's even more slanted. In 172 editorials over a month, there were 108 written by columnists of those 2 papers, 28 academics, 20 government officials, including police chiefs, 2 organizers of protests, but no voices of victims and no voices from the families of victims. On the talk shows, Sunday morning On the major news networks, there were 54 interviews over 2 weeks, 35 government officials, including national security spokespeople, 24 journalists, 2 academics, 1 attorney for Floyd, and 1 spokesperson for Black Lives Matter. That's the sources. That's a bias. It's not a conspiracy. It's how the media do business. What kind of descriptions? Well, we can look at the headlines of the news media. Here's sample headlines. A night of fire and fury across America. Not a night of democracy in action, but a night of fury and fire. Appeals for calm as protests spiral out of control. By October, NBC News didn't even try to give it some cautious frame. They simply said protests erupt into riots and looting. The descriptions are clear, and you can read this, you can see this. Looters, rioters, violent thugs, disrupting public safety, a network of urban warfare, abject criminal behavior causing anarchy and chaos. Are we getting a context? No. Again, because the preference of the media is what happened in the last 15 minutes, what happened in the last day. So they focus on the immediate episode and the spectacle of confrontation class image. That's much more exciting, attracts more attention than a peaceful protest or a sit-in or a picnic or a family rally. Instead, showing us a trash can burning or a garbage truck burning, that's a spectacle. But it avoids the recent and current conditions that give rise to the protest. It avoids the whole conditions of injustice and oppression. A context of racism is completely wiped out. You don't read about 6,500 citizens killed in the last 5 years, or that 10% of the police killing black citizens, less than 10%, are charged. Even fewer are convicted. Yale report said that police practice paramilitary, dehumanizing actions against blacks regularly. The point is, police killing blacks are not single isolated incidents, but that's how it appears in the media. And then the response is, you're overreacting. The context of racism in general is whited out. Unemployment's at 17%. The recession took 50% of black wealth. School segregation is higher than 30 years ago. Blacks die from COVID at 4 times the rate of white deaths. Blacks are 13% of the population, but a third of the prison population, and majority of African Americans live in segregated neighborhoods. That's our life, and on top of that, you're gonna take our life? Of course there's outrage, but racist police practices are only part of the structural inequality. I'll give you one example. Jacob Blake, Kenosha, August 23rd, shot in the back 7 times while he was leaning over in the back seat talking to his kids. He was paralyzed and then handcuffed to the bed. There was a rally a week later by his family called Justice for Jacob. 12 speakers, including his dad. They called for police reform and told people to go vote. They had poetry readings. They sang songs. They made pledges and pleas to peaceful protest. So this was a rally for unity in Kenosha. And how did the Kenosha News report it? This was their headline. Kenosha speaker, if you kill one of us, it's time for us to kill one of yours. That was the selected headline. The reporter that wrote the news complained to the editor. He said, that person was not in the rally, that person was at the end of the rally, we don't even know that person's name, and you chose that to make the headline. And the editor said, well, that was said, it's accurate, and it's a threat. The reporter quit the Kenosha News because this, he said, was an inappropriate framing of the conditions we find. What that suggests to me is that this is not an occasional outcome, but instead it's a choice of the media of how the news will be framed. And racism is embedded in the institutional hierarchies, practices, vocabularies, norms, and expectations. There can't be a crime if there isn't a law. Rosa Parks was a criminal. Martin Luther King was a criminal. College students at the Woolworth counter were criminals. Crossing the Pettus Bridge was a crime. Registering to vote was a crime. Reading was a crime. In 2020, it's not criminal to rip citizens off at check cashing fees. It's not criminal to refuse Blacks bank loans or to make loans with high costs or to have housing segregation as long as you don't redline or discriminate in hiring. It's not criminal to use SAT scores to get into college. None of these are criminal, but all of these are racist practices that are legal. At the same time, peaceful protests and organized action for justice is presented as if it is criminal, as if it's a disruption to public order. So the meaning of race in the 21st century is constructed by the structures of inequality, social class, economic insecurity, even the consent of the Black professional classes. But race is not natural. It's normalized with resources, organized repetition. Police killings cause protests. Racism causes police killings. And media framing is but one of the more powerful instances of racism. I would prefer a frame that values life over profit, over giving us actual conditions that indicate the violence of racism is worse than any resistance to racism. No one has ever gotten their freedom or equality by appealing to the moral sense of their oppressor. You can't talk racism away. That's why we need protests. We have demonstrations, rallies, boycotts, citizen referendum on the police, community control, and public participation. It's why 26 million people demonstrated, and why some have developed political programs and community-based actions, why some have found voices of action for justice silenced and dismissed. That's what I found, but I didn't want to use all of my time just to make that point. Instead, I thought I would use part of this presentation to hear one of those voices. So I'm very happy that my guest is from Minneapolis, from the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, which began in 2014. So they were well organized and well connected in Minneapolis and St. Paul before the Floyd killing. And my guest today is from the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice. My guest is Jae Yates, who does media work and public outreach for the Twin Cities Coalition. Jay is a graduate of the University of Minnesota in anthropology, been living and working in Minneapolis for years. And I welcome you, Jae Yates. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jay, I'd like you to kind of weigh in on some of the things that I argued here. I just wonder how the media in Minneapolis has covered the protests and the organizing that you've done in city squares and elsewhere.
Yeah, so media in the Twin Cities right now is very interesting because there's sort of mainstream media, but there's also a lot of independent media who are usually like community members, like regular people that do live streams, that have Facebook pages, that cover our protests from beginning to end, as opposed to what a lot of the mainstream media does is, you know, they show up at the beginning for like the first like 2 speakers or whatever, and then they leave. And so they don't get the full context of the action, where we have other independent media like King Demetrius Hill, which is one of the independent media that shows up to like every protest that we have. He will stay until the whole thing, like he live streams the whole thing. There's no like chopping up of like anything that happened. You get anything that happened at the action is there in record. And so I think that there's this framing by our mainstream media in Minneapolis of, you know, what constitutes violence, and to them, what constitutes violence is property destruction. Whenever they report on, you know, reports of violence by the police, it's never framed as violence. It's framed as the police protecting the community. It's framed as the police, it's sometimes even framed as the police trying to protect protesters, which is never true. And so it's this weird kind of double standard of, you know, the police, when they shoot us with tear gas and rubber bullets and you know, beat people in the middle of the street like they did at the first few nights of protesting, when they destroy medic stations, when they arrest and intimidate medics that are just trying to help injured protesters that were hurt by the police, when they respond to, incidences that they weren't invited to respond to, that were already under control by the community, by community like patrols or what have you, that is never framed as violence. It's only violent if we burn a building or if we like throw a bottle at
but
the
I
cops.
know you didn't burn a building, Jay.
Exactly. And so I think too, like, it's a lot of, us defending ourselves from the cops is not violence. I mean, like, we are often getting kettled by them. We're getting, people get like literally dragged off in the middle of protests by police and arrested, are often injured in that process. And that's no one ever calls that violent. It's only if we in any way retaliate.
So if this is how the media, Minneapolis media is covering the protests and police actions, I'm curious as to what was nationally explained that the city council in Minneapolis was moving to abolish the police, restructure the police, and they passed a resolution. And that was shared nationally, and that got lots of Blue Lives Matter concerned that the police were going away. And that's one of the shifting points that I found in my research, is that when that became shared nationally, many media began to disparage defunding the police. But I'm kind of curious, where is that at now in Minneapolis? What is the status of the city council's move to change policing?
So city council regretted saying that almost immediately. And I think that groups like Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar knew that city council would never follow through on anything close to that. But as far as it stands now, city council is not moving to defund the police. Instead, they have instituted things like more community policing. There is a group that city council put together that we call the Orange Shirts. They have some sort of, very corny like name about like community policing. I don't remember what it is. But they have been showing up to protests and basically assisting the police in suppressing protests. And they've been doing that we only saw them for a few weeks. We haven't seen them at any of our recent actions, but we know that they still exist. And Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar put out a statement about the Orange Shirts, about how, this is not what we asked of city council. We have been asking city council to give the community control of police. And that's not community policing. We don't want people snitching on each other to the police. We want the police to be held accountable for their actions by the community and by the people that are affected by policing. So their response has largely been to institute these sort of like pointless little kind of programs to not give us what we asked for, but to assist in the police.
Have those reforms, even the way you're explaining them, might be questionable if they're reforms, but they're presented as reforms. Have they had an impact on support for your actions, or have they had an impact on the larger community that they say, well, at least they're doing something? That's kind of one of the responses. So I just wonder if that's something you can discern.
Yeah, I think that there are some people that are like, well, at least like, I think many of them are white and many of them are not like directly affected by police brutality. The city council's trying kind of narratives. But I also think that in Minneapolis, people are really disillusioned with city council right now, in part because their kind of defund whole initiative was really quickly proven to just be about publicity and just be about sort of placating people to stop protests, and rather than them being about actually doing anything meaningful. And so I think that in a weird way, city council's failure has gotten a lot more support for us, for our initiative, for pushing for CPAC and community control of the police, because it just really proved to the people of Minneapolis that they weren't going to do anything, that they had no interest in really doing anything meaningful. They just wanted the protests to stop.
Well, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because defund police was like one of the primary things, although I know that Black Lives Matter nationally has kind of even backed away from that demand. But I also know that Black Lives Matter has not been championing community control of the police. So how, you said CPAC, what does that mean? And how does your coalition and others in Minneapolis conceive of community control of the police? What does that mean exactly?
Sure. So community control of the police is the concept behind a CPAC, which a CPAC stands for Civilian Police Accountability Council. And basically it's an elected panel of 9 community members who, one of the requirements for them running is to have no direct previous employment with police departments. They cannot be former cops. And they also have to disclose if they have relatives that are cops, because what happens here anyway, and I'm sure this happens in other counties and countries as well, is that the police, the BCA is basically made up of other cops who, like, their main interest is in exonerating their fellow cops when they kill someone or when they have a misconduct suit put against them. So we see that as a massive conflict of interest. And so we're pretty adamant about, like, one of the stipulations of being on the council being not having that sort of like direct relationship. Of course, you can't help it if, you know, your dad was a cop, but you need to disclose that and sort of talk more to the people about why then you should serve on this council. So it's basically it's not the same as sort of like these oversight initiatives. CPACs have direct control over hiring practices, firing practices. They investigate all charges of misconduct. That's like the main job of people on the council, is to have themselves and a workforce of people working under them to investigate any crimes committed by the police. They determine the budget for police departments within the CPAC. So to the point of, you know, defunding or even abolishing the police, our view and my view is that that's only possible with community control, because there's no reason to expect that a city council would ever do something like that. A lot of them are in the pocket of like the police union. So there's just no, our position is basically that we don't trust city council to do that on their own. And so getting a CPAC and giving the control over the police back to the communities and giving them that sort of self-determining power is the only way to accomplish things like defunding, or if a district decides to abolish and remake their police department, it has to be under CPAC.
Is the coalition's call for the CPAC widely known?
Yeah, I think that, like, previously, and I was under this impression as well, you know, I'd heard of like community control of police, like very briefly when I was like studying like Black Panther initiatives, because they're the original kind of champions of this idea. But it was extremely brief in the course that I took, and I kind of assumed, based on the name and based on what I had learned, that it was the same as community policing, which is, you know, that officer friendly, cops are going to have a barbecue in the park and then like use that as a way to get people to inform on their neighbors to the cops, which obviously, like, we all know is bad. And so I kind of thought, you know, this sounds like it would be that, but I think, like I said, city council's recent blunders, and also our efforts in really trying to push CPAC at all of our actions, really trying to organize around that, holding basically community like read-throughs of the legislation we wrote, which is actually based on Chicago's legislation. I think that that's really gotten sort of the word out as to what it is and how it can actually accomplish a lot of these things that people in the community are still calling for, like defunding.
Right. Well, excellent. Jay, you and I could keep talking. I have more questions, but I'm assuming, Karen, that there are chat questions, and I don't want to take up. I'd prefer to let other people ask questions and voice their things. And if they want to ask Jay or me, that's okay. But
Sure. No, that's right. It's been a very active chat so far. And so, Jay, in particular, folks are really impressed by your activism and are wondering if you'd be willing to share more of your story. How did you get started? Who or what inspired you?
Yeah, so I moved to Minneapolis in, I think, 2015 or 2016. So I moved here like right when Twin Cities Coalition for Jamar was founded, but I didn't get involved like with them directly until this year. I helped organize our Taking Back Pride protest, but that's how I had heard of Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar. When I first moved here, I was kind of like, I was a younger college student, sort of getting my first, baby's first radicalization, and, had just come out and was going to Pride and was really disillusioned with how corporate it was and with, the cop presence. And the following year, I happened to go to the march and saw Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar's banner because they were protesting corporate pride. And so I went to a couple more of their protests. I went to some of their Philando Castile actions when he was murdered. But I never really felt that it was like my place to actually like be an organizer. I think that when you see other people sort of like doing the work, you have this sort of like almost like celebrity worship of them, of like, oh, like they're doing the work and I couldn't possibly have anything to offer to that. But this summer, TCC for J put out a call about Pride and about how they were still planning on organizing something because the big Pride parade that the city puts on wasn't going to happen this year. And so I kind of felt that, given what I had been doing earlier in the summer with mutual aid, that, I don't know, I guess I just felt that this was the time to actually like step up and start like really doing the work in the sense of actually organizing. Because I think that there's such a huge difference between sort of participating in these events, which is also, important and good to do, but there's a difference between that and, actually doing political organizing. And there's a difference between studying this, which I had been doing in college, and actually like doing the on the ground work. And so I guess this moment sort of gave me the permission to reprioritize things and to just like start doing stuff. Really, that's really all activism is you just like start doing stuff and see what you can offer to the movement.
Thank you. So here's another Twin Cities specific question, Jay. Do you think that Minneapolis or the Twin Cities area has the resources in order to aid police in their service to the community? Do you see Minneapolis as being a model for other parts of the country? How do you think that other professionals, like mental health professionals, for instance, can get involved in using some of those deallocated police funds?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, we have to recognize that all of us are working under a system that is oppressive. Like, the police are not the only ones that participate in a racist system. EMTs and first responders also contribute to the deaths of Black people in Minneapolis specifically. Jamar's case, for example, the EMTs were really, a big part of the reason why he ended up dying in custody. and why that call was made in the first place to the police. And so I think that, you know, part of, before you even get to like, how do like doctors and mental health professionals like reallocate those funds and how do they sort of help, I think that the first step has to be sort of decolonizing these practices and examining like why first responders respond the way they do. Why did some first responders in the city feel justified and comfortable administering ketamine to people without their consent, for example, in many police calls that they were called to? You know, why did they feel that the police ordering them to do that was something that they should follow through on? And so, yeah, I think that after that happens, I think that a lot of it is about just reimagining like a future without police. I think that that's the biggest barrier for a lot of people, is just that they can't imagine what it's like to live where your first response to an emergency is to call the police. But another way is possible. And the police are ill-equipped to handle a lot of the things that they're called to respond to anyways. So yeah, I think that hiring people that can respond to those is sort of the real reallocation of those funds.
Thank you for that. So this next question goes to either or both of you. How does one explain systemic racism to someone who doesn't believe it exists? And the follow-up is there a successful example or framework to deal with systemic racism in institutions? Don't fight over it.
Answer first. Like, I guess I can answer really quick. Like I think that the first thing is, if they don't believe in systemic racism, I don't know, like maybe they need to go outside more. I really don't know. But I think that like for me, historical examples are really useful in explaining systemic racism. I think that when you can take people kind of back to the inception of racist ideology in the United States and sort of who it served and, you know, how it served capitalism specifically, I think that kind of taking them through that journey can be useful, but that's like, you know, it's a long-term project, I think, like getting someone who just like willfully refuses to believe that racism is systemic to like bring them along. I think that that's like a project that you would have to commit to. But I think that, you know, using history as your guide for that could be helpful. And I mean, I think real life examples as much as possible. As for like fighting in institutions, I mean, yeah, I think it's tricky because like, you know, as academics or people that are trained up in academia, like that system seems really comfortable. And I think that a lot of times academia can give people this false sense of like progressiveness without actually necessarily being truly progressive. And so I guess it's sort of like a constant examining of academia and always trying to, I guess, question its motives. It's kind of like one major things that I would say. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question.
I think Jay's explanation is good, because I think people have to experience, and that's obviously the best way for someone to understand the world, is to actually get out and experience it. But lacking that, I think that we use examples. I know I coached high school basketball for a long time, and I was in New Buffalo, which had $25,000 per student annual expense. When we would play Covert, which is a largely black high school up in the middle of Michigan, they have like $2,000 per student. And when our kids would go to their gym and see their facilities, it was like they couldn't comprehend it, but they could make the connection between a largely black school and the resources that were available, and New Buffalo, which was largely white school and we get money because we tax Illinois people, but that's a separate question. So that experience would affected the ball players that I was coaching. And I would say the example of the Floyd is a good example, right? I mean, the fact that there was a video that somebody took, the same thing happened after Staten Island, the same thing happens after Trayvon Martin. The thing, when people see it, it's hard to say, no, that's fake, that's not true, that's not the conditions. So I think that's a very important thing, which is why the media framing for me is so important, for us to be able to understand how this happens. No, there's not a lot, I mean, ignorant in the sense that we don't know, but people don't know, but it's not because they can't know or aren't capable of knowing or aren't capable of being different. It's that given what they do know, why would they think or act any way differently? So that's part of it. I also would say the other part of the question, is there any examples? I think there's historic examples. I think what Jay's saying about you got to look back at things. I think the Black Panthers and their ability to make alliances with white citizens in the city of Oakland. I think the whole history of the UAW and Henry Ford that would go south and give free train tickets to blacks that would come up and work in River Rouge, and they would try to separate black and white workers into separate unions. And when the UAW broke with that, wow, they suddenly had a more powerful union, more powerful job security, better working conditions, decent standard of living, and they changed the relationship that they had because they made that black-white unity through the union. So, and I mean, this isn't a history class, but I think there's many of those examples. And why don't we know it? Because we're in public schools where the school boards don't want us to know it, right? Rather than having 1619, the White House wants 1776. So when Columbus landed, it was a good thing. When there wasn't anybody living west of the Mississippi, nobody was there, never, right? And white people just went there, right? So it's partly the history, but there's multiple examples of history where people are able to have that experience and make those, I would argue, multiracial, independent political action that was very powerful.
Well stated, both of you. So we have just about 7 minutes left and quite a few questions, some from students that I'd love to get in here, and a three-parter that I think is very important. But before I get to those, I just want to share a few comments that, you know, for me as a Black woman, were a little shocking to me, this one particular comment in the chat, and that is, so many of my friends are eliminating 911 from, so many of my Black friends are eliminating 911 from their family members' call lists because they obviously don't trust law enforcement, and instead they're replacing 911 with a network of other families and friends. I just thought that was worth sharing. I had not heard of that, although I can tell you as an aunt to many nephews and nieces, it is the talk is a talk that we have on a regular basis. Another comment, it's not just about the excessive use of force by police on unarmed, non-threatening Black citizens. It's about getting the proper justice for wrongful actions. And I just wanted to plug and tie in to our previous talk, which was Professor Nikki Jackson, who interviewed Roosevelt Glenn, an exoneree who served 18 years and was wrongfully convicted, even though the DNA evidence existed pre-trial. So I invite audience members to find that discussion as well. So here's a couple of questions from students. I'm an amateur videographer and photographer. How can I learn to use my hobby and skill to become an independent journalist? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that one of the really important things about the independent journalists that, like, you know, we feel like we really trust is that, like, first and foremost, they're members of the community. Like, they're not there for, like, profit. They're there because they think that it's something that's worth documenting, and that it's something that, you know, matters to have, like, our perspective rather than just sort of like mainstream media perspectives on our actions. And so I think that like a lot of it is about motive, and a lot of it is about sort of how you go about doing it. Because I think just showing up to a protest and being like, I'm an independent media journalist, like that can be tough because a lot of us don't trust like journalists because of the way that they have like smeared movements, the way that they've like outright like misquoted people, and the way that they frame their stories a lot of times. And so I think that like there is a lot of distrust, and so you have to be like willing to build that. So I mean, I would probably say to join an organization first, and sort of get established, before just like jumping in. But also like I can't stop you from doing that if you want to.
Sure, Jay. Thank you. Professor Artz and Jay, thank you for offering such an enlightening presentation today. What do you think individuals can do in their daily lives to dismantle racism? Part one. Part two, are there alternatives to protests that can be effective, in particular in the age of COVID-19? And then the third part, how can students take action in their communities and particularly at PNW?
Yeah, I guess I have some thoughts on that. I don't want to talk over Dr. Artz, but yeah, like I think to the first point, like which was how can individuals like dismantle racism? I think that that's the whole point, is that individuals can't dismantle racism. That's a very like American sort of a view of collective action, of like, you know, what can I do as an individual? Like, what can I buy? What businesses can I support? Like, what can I do? And that is a recipe for defeat. We will lose if everyone is sort of coming at this from an independent lens. The power of protests is in sort of like what a lot of people call people power. It's collective power. It's not about what an individual is doing. It's about an individual committing to actions as a whole. And so I guess my answer is there isn't anything that you can do as an individual. The only thing as an individual that you can do is decide to join community efforts and to really invest yourself in collective action, because that's where our power lies. As to the second part, which was about I might mix up the last one.
No, it's COVID. It's
COVID,
okay,
right?
so we want to protest, but yeah.
Other than protests. Actually, there's a lot of work to do that is not protesting. I think that sometimes the issue is that people think that, you know, activism begins and ends at a protest, and that's absolutely not true. I think that getting involved with organizations that are advocating for community-controlled police is something that we push a lot. We push people to, you know, if you can't come to a protest, that's absolutely fine. There's so much to do outside of that, like come to our meetings, join an organization like Communities United Against Police Brutality, which does a lot of legislative work and support for families. You can join any number of like the medic teams that provide street medic services, or that are kind of filling the gaps between EMT responses, or we're doing that in the early days of the uprising. Yeah, like there's like always like call-in campaigns to legislators. There's so much happening. You just have to like actually plug in to what's going on. I think mutual aid is also really important. Of if you can't give your physical space, you can give your money, or you can boost people's needs for that. And then to the last thing, with like, sorry, can you repeat the last question?
How can students take action in their communities, and particularly
I think students are really important in this moment. We work with SDS occasionally, which is the Students for Democratic Society at the University of Minnesota's campus. And they actually have been pushing for their own version of community control campus police, basically, and really organizing around that. And so like, I think that students have a lot of collective power that isn't always used, but a lot of what you're kind of seeing in the outside world can be done on campus as well. Those are demands that can also be demands of your provost, of your leadership at your university. And so I think that that's something I didn't really realize as a student. Like, it was kind of like, oh, the outside world like affects me on campus, and like I can't necessarily affect campus. But you absolutely can and should advocate for those things.
Jay, I just want you to know that folks are just all over you in the chat. You got at least one "I love you" so far. People think you're making really excellent points, and we need more exposure and time with folks who are fighting on the front line. So thank you again on behalf of all of us for being here today. There is time maybe for one last question, and then I will turn it over to Lee and to Jay for the last words. And that question is, what is Jay's coalition doing as a result of this year's election? How are they going to respond to either presidential candidate winning or losing?
That is really great that you asked that, because we actually have a protest tomorrow that is happening regardless of the outcome, because our position is that, like, you know, Joe Biden, though slightly better, I guess, than Donald Trump, is still an instrument of empire. He is still, he still wants to, you know, criminalize protesters. He still wants to, he wants police to stay at least similar to how they are. And obviously that's not really an option at this point. And so I think that our commitment really isn't to a specific political party, but more to, we are committed to being against the forces of empire and living under sort of this capitalist state. And so when you're committed to that, like, who's in the presidential seat doesn't really matter. It's more about pressuring them to meet our demands. And so, yeah, I think that we're just really trying to push forward the narrative that, you know, like, liberation doesn't have a political party, that it's an ideology rather than us rallying behind a Democrat that has historically done many of the same things to Black communities that Republican presidents have done. I mean, Flint happened under Obama. Bombings happened under Obama. And I think a lot of it is also about solidarity with other movements in other countries, like Free Palestine, like political repression in India. And so, yeah, there's like a lot happening. And I think that we are really trying to get people to focus on this as more of an issue of party lines. It's a fundamental problem with, like, the American state rather than just like who's in political office.
Thank you, Jay. Professor Artz, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you for all the people that had questions and all the people that we couldn't get to their questions. I really appreciate what Jay had to say about how social change comes about, that individuals don't do it by ourselves individually, but we do it individually when we cooperate and collaborate and act in solidarity with others. So I would say, even that videographer that asked, everyone can write, talk, do videos, but they should write and talk and do videos in collaboration and cooperation with a group that has a plan, so that your research and your explanation of that can be shared with others, so it has a much greater impact. Specifically, I think of a few things. I think it would be possible in a city like Hammond or in Northwest Indiana, Michigan City, where a coalition could put a referendum on the ballot that would say, we want a CPAC, a police accountability panel council. That doesn't mean you're going to get it answered, but it does mean that you're going to be able to engage large numbers of people in that discussion, which wouldn't happen if there wasn't a referendum. Likewise, there's boycotts that are possible, boycotts against public institutions and private institutions, not at random, but when collectively people say that this is a good thing that we could do to draw home the point that they have discriminatory hiring or discriminatory treatment, and we aren't going to accept that. So I think that's very important. And what Jay says is, well, I think what this whole series was about, that we can't just share ideas with each other, but these ideas should be part of a larger effort to build a collective response, a collective resistance. I had, and I would ask Jay in closing to give the best link so that people could find Twin Cities Coalition for Justice. I had one on a slide, but it'd probably be better if Jay just repeats it. And I really want to thank Jay for spending time with us today. And I hope that they come back in January, because we're trying to put together a panel of activists in January for the opening of our series. And thank you, Jay.
Yeah, so our website is TCC, the number 4, and then the letter J. T is in taco, C is in coalition, C is in cot, the number 4, and then J for justice is our website. And then you can also, I mean, you can email me, like, my TCC for J email is, I think it's j.yates@tccforj.net. And then I still have my U of M email, which is yates107@umn.edu. Yeah.
That's great. We'll make sure that we put those up. And thank you so much for being forthcoming with that.
For sure.
Be forewarned. I'd just like to add my thanks to Professor Artz again for Jae Yates. And I also want to take the last second to just do a very quick plug for the next talk in our series, which is coming up on November 30th with Dr. Kim Sipes, How to Talk About Race in the 21st Century, on November 30th, 2 o'clock to 3:15. We'd just like to thank everyone again for joining us today. It is Election Day. Please vote if you haven't already. And thank you. We hope to see you again at the end of the month.